When people hear the term clinical informatics, it can mean different things depending on what organization you're in. For some, it's a large department that sits within or adjacent to IT that most clinicians and administrative staff are familiar with. In others, it might be just one or two people that either sit within IT or within a clinical department who take on clinical informatics type work but don't have the actual title. If we look at the definition, the American Medical Informatics Association defines it as the science of how to use data, technology, and knowledge to improve human health and the delivery of healthcare services. While that's entirely accurate, it's a pretty broad definition. In practical terms, clinical informatics is really that space between care delivery and the technology that's used to support it. It focuses on making sure digital systems are helping clinicians and support staff deliver care safely and effectively. Before we go any further, if you're new here, I'm Dre. I've been working in healthcare for over 25 years and have spent the last couple decades focused on health IT roles. All right, let's talk a little bit more about what clinical informatics is really all about. So one thing that you'll learn pretty quickly in this field is that technology doesn't work in isolation. Clinical systems generate the data that supports patient care, quality measurement, reporting, and research. But the value of that information depends very heavily on how these systems are designed, configured, and used in everyday workflows. That's where clinical informatics comes in. On the one hand, you have clinicians who understand how care is delivered and what information they need to make decisions. On the other side, you have analysts, engineers, and vendors who understand what the technology is capable of and how the systems can be configured. Clinical informatics is the bridge between those two. They help translate clinical needs into system design and help translate technical capabilities into workflows that make sense for clinicians. When informatics functions are weak or under-resourced, software often ends up reflecting how the system works instead of how clinical care works. Over time, documentation becomes more cumbersome, alerts may increase, clinicians create workarounds for things, and data quality slowly starts to degrade. On the other hand, when clinical informatics functions are strong, systems are intentionally designed and configured with clinical workflows in mind. Documentation supports both patient care and downstream reporting. Decision support tools are carefully evaluated instead of being left at their out-of-the-box defaults. And system changes are introduced with an understanding about how they're going to impact existing workflows. One way to think about the perspective that an informaticist brings is to think of the questions that different people might ask. A clinician might ask, will this help me take care of my patient? An analyst is going to ask, can this actually be built? And an informaticist is going to ask, if we do build this, what other workflows is this going to impact and what sort of downstream effects will it have? It's really the broader perspective of how all those technology pieces fit into everything that differentiates clinical informaticists from purely technical or purely clinical roles. In general, informaticists tend to focus on a few key things. They help align digital systems with clinical workflows. They support the use of clinical data and decision support tools. They work with various teams to improve how the systems are used and adopted. And they help coordinate a lot of conversations between clinical, technical, and operational groups. So they may spend their time with a physician reviewing an order set to make sure it aligns with best practice. They might be discussing a configuration change with analysts to understand what impacts it could have for reporting or quality metrics. They may be reviewing documentation templates to make sure that the information that's going to be captured supports clinical need and also administrative or operational requirements. Or they may be participating in governance discussions where multiple requests for system changes have to be prioritized due to competing resources. The common thread across all of this is collaboration, and those clinical informaticists really sit in the middle of a whole bunch of conversations. They regularly interact with clinicians, IT teams, project managers, leadership groups, educators, and sometimes even vendors. And each group in a lot of those discussions brings a different perspective to the table. So the informaticist will help guide that conversation so that all of those perspectives can be brought together to better support patient care. The scope of the role can vary quite a bit depending on the size and type of organization. In a smaller hospital, you might have one or two people that are covering all aspects of clinical informatics for every single department. So they may be involved in everything from design to review to adoption to report analysis, ongoing for everyone. Or you may be in a larger organization where there's an entire informatics department and things are carved out into more specialist type roles. In those situations, you may have pharmacy informaticists who only focus on the workflows and systems that pharmacy and pharmacy techs are interacting with on a daily basis. Or you may have people that are targeted for just nursing or surgical or niche type areas where they can really focus on everything they need to, but they cover all the breadth of activities that happen in those areas. If you're wondering what kind of individual becomes a clinical informaticist, the majority of people actually come from a clinical background, and nursing is one of those strongest pathways to enter. However, that doesn't mean that everyone comes from nursing or even that everyone comes from clinical. You also might see analysts that come from clinical application teams or different areas within the hospital, but almost every single individual that is going to come into the role has some experience in a healthcare setting already. If you're thinking of a role in informatics, it's important to note that the job can be kind of stressful sometimes. Informaticists are often in situations where they're expected to understand system-wide implications of requests that are being made by multiple groups. In a lot of cases, the informaticist isn't the final decision maker on any of the changes that are going into production, but they are someone whose opinion and whose perspective on things is going to be heavily weighed by the decision makers. So they're really informing everyone who's going to be making the decisions, and they're looking to the informaticist to be able to provide accurate information. Other teams really rely on them to bring up things that they may not have considered. So functioning in that kind of role requires a particular set of skills. Informaticists need to be comfortable mapping workflows and identifying variations. They need to be able to anticipate downstream impacts when things are changing. And they need to be excellent communicators who can work across multiple disciplines. They translate technical concepts into clinical context and clinical concerns into technical requirements. They also need to have really strong facilitation skills, especially when they're working with groups who have different priorities. And they need to be comfortable working in situations where there isn't a clear path right away. So if you're a clinician and you like thinking about processes and how systems can influence care delivery, informatics might be a natural extension of your interests. And if you're an analyst who wants to spend more time focused on how the technology that you're currently working with actually translates into care delivery, then informatics might be something to look into. And even as technology continues to evolve, healthcare organizations are always going to need someone who understands both sides of the equation, how care is delivered and how the systems that are put in place to support care delivery behave. So I hope this video helped you understand a little bit more about what clinical informatics is really all about. And if you're interested in more health IT topics, I encourage you to tune in for the next video. See you again next time.